Our last Rome lecture. The end of the short-lived Flavian dynasty in 96 CE was followed by almost a century of stable and capable rules by the adoptive emperors, called this because each adopted his most promising subordinate as his successor, rather than passing on leadership to a son. During this period, the population of Rome may have reached 500,000, making it the largest city in the world. The Roman provinces also flourished, and with that prosperity came widespread acceptance of Roman rule. There were exceptions, such as the rebellion in Jerusalem. It's also worth noting that while the urban elite enjoyed increasing prosperity, taxes, rents, and military service made life in the countryside much less economically secure. None of these portrait busts required work, but looking at them together, what kind of image do you think these emperors were promoting? You see that the faces are stern, but not entirely idealized. Neither do they reach the extremes of Republican verism. These emperors are deliberately evoking ancient Greece, but we see this tinged with a Roman sense of command. For the most part, the adoptive emperors were content to maintain the territorial limits of the empire, but the notable exception was Trajan. He conquered the troublesome Dacians on the north shore of the Danube, and in 114 CE went to war with the Parthian Empire, Rome's rival to the east, occupying southern Mesopotamia all the way to the Persian Gulf. This was as large and powerful as the Roman Empire would ever get, and after this the borders of the empire slowly retreated. Within Rome, Trajan's biggest project was a forum, twice the size of Augustus's forum. Trajan's architect was Apollodorus of Damascus, who had been his chief military engineer during the Dacian campaign. At first, I was a little surprised that Trajan's forum featured so heavily in the new curriculum. There are 4 College Board images associated with this complex. But I've decided now that this choice makes a lot of sense. Why might the College Board have chosen the entire forum as one of their required works? Well, think about how this massive public space sent the clear message that Rome was at the center of the military, commercial, and legal world, and that its emperor, Trajan, ruled justly, but firmly, and with absolute command. This overall plan of the forum is not one of your required images, but it does help connect the required works. Number 1 is the Temple of Trajan, behind Trajan's column. Number 2. Roman emperors were now gods, a claim that created problems for the small but growing body of Christians in the empire. They did not object to giving homage to emperors, but they did object to giving homage to emperor gods. But what really strikes me is that the temple was not the centerpiece of this forum. The really huge building, number 4, was the Basilica Ulpia. This was a major administrative building. It contained the law courts and administrative offices. It seems to me that Trajan and his architect were signaling that just and efficient rule was the most important element of power and authority in Trajan's Rome, not the emperor's godlike status. The big open space 5 is the forum itself, surrounded by stoa, or covered colonnaded offices and shops, and dominated by a now lost statue of Hadrian on horseback, number 6. Rome was the commercial center of the world, and number 3, the libraries, one for Greek texts, one for Latin, signaled that Rome was also the center of learning, the heir to the intellectual tradition of Athens, and a creative force in its own right. So the forum is all about the power and authority of Rome. Here is a reconstruction of the Basilica Ulpia, again the main administrative center of Trajan's Rome. Ulpia, by the way, was Trajan's family name. The basilica is essentially a large rectangular room with a high timber ceiling and 2 semicircles at either end. These are called apses. Later, when the basilica style was adapted by Christian churches, the apse would appear at only one end and would hold the altar. In the Roman basilica, the apse also housed an altar, but it was more significantly where the judge would sit during legal proceedings. Sacrifices would be made on the altar just before the legal proceedings to lend divine authority to the judge's rulings. Another major difference between a Roman and a Christian basilica is that the entrance to a church is on the short side of the rectangle, on the wall opposite the apse. One entered a Roman basilica on the long side. Note that clerestory windows are used to bring in light and air. The bottom floor was largely walled off from the outside. The large central area was the nave, a term we still use in churches, while the side area set off by columns were aisles. Built on a hill adjacent to the Forum was what is now arguably the world's first shopping mall. One of the greatest accomplishments of Roman architecture was the erection of huge multi-story complexes, apartment houses as well as shopping centers. Note that, like the Colosseum, the massive scale depended on the use of arches and concrete. The basilica you just saw, by contrast, relied on the more traditional post and lintel construction. Note that the complex included apartments as well as shops. Exedra is another term for apse, the semicircular additions to a rectangular basilica. Here we get a look at the partly reconstructed indoor shopping area. The basic unit in the market was the taberna, a single-room shop covered by a barrel vault. Excuse me. Each taberna had a wide doorway, usually with a window above it. The shops were on several levels. They opened either onto one of the Forum's large exedra, onto a paved street farther up the hill, or onto a great indoor market hall. The ceiling was a concrete groin vault. Second-floor shops were set back and then lit from skylights cut into the groin vaults. Remember that one of the huge advantages of concrete was that it permitted the architects to include windows without significantly weakening the structure. I've talked about how the arch was Rome's most important architectural innovation, along, of course, with concrete. But another characteristically Roman architectural work was the column. These columns were actually based in part on Egyptian obelisks. You see one of these on the right. The 128-foot-high column tells the story of Trajan's conquest of the Dacians. But what I find especially fascinating is that so many of the sculptures in the frieze focus on Roman military engineering rather than on battles. Here's one example. Rather amazingly, only about a quarter of the frieze is devoted to battle scenes, even though the entire column celebrates Trajan's victories over the Dacians. Here are some more scenes from the column. This photo makes it easier to see the spiral shape of the friez's registers. There are more than 2,500 figures on this column, and since the ancient Romans would not have had a zoom function, they would not have been able to follow the story very easily, even though the bright paint that once covered the frieze would have helped, as would the somewhat wider frieze registers at the top. Note that the relief was quite low, so that it did not obscure the general shape of the column. Still, the work was pretty clearly designed to overwhelm as much as to inform. Don't mess with Trajan, don't mess with the Romans. Entryway into the Forum would have been through a triumphal arch, no longer standing, but here's another triumphal arch, also dedicated to Trajan, that still stands in southern Italy. Hadrian, Trajan's successor and another emperor probably born in Spain, loved all things Greek and deliberately imitated what he viewed as the style and appearance of a Greek philosopher. He would have welcomed the comparison to Pericles. Among the public works sponsored by Hadrian was this extraordinarily important work, which will continue to show up in this course. The Pantheon was an engineering feat that reflected 300 years of Roman experimentation with concrete, including techniques for making lighter and lighter concrete at the upper levels of the dome. We did not exactly stint on last night's homework, but we did not assign the Khan Academy video on the Pantheon. That's because we wanted to make sure that everyone actually watched it. We did include ECB questions on the Pantheon, and as you saw, there were a lot of them. Take notes into your workbook, okay? There are almost always questions about the Pantheon on the AP exam. This bird's eye view gives you a little better sense of the dome and oculus, and also the portico entrance. Here you see a diagram that shows the different kinds of concrete used at each level of the building, as well as a reconstruction of the Pantheon with its original forecourt. Here we see the majestic interior with its vast reach and multicolored marble. The coffers, those indentations in the ceiling, were not only an important element of decoration, they significantly reduced the weight of the dome. Here are two floor plans with some more terms you should know: rotunda, portico, oculus, and coffered ceiling. Now we're going to take a brief detour away from Rome, traveling east to Petra, in what today is Jordan. Let me just note that the College Board puts this work under its unit on West and Central Asia. We don't use the College Board's unit organization, which we and almost every art history teacher I know find illogical and confusing. Nabatea eventually became a column of Rome, but it was always a crossroads between East and West. To me, it seems more like part of the ancient Mediterranean world, but really it could fit either place. Petra was the capital city of the Nabatean kingdom. During Hellenistic and Roman times, Petra became a major caravan center. As rulers of a commercial and cultural crossroads, the Nabateans tended to borrow from many influences in their architecture. It was, in other words, eclectic. This area is now completely desert, but the Nabateans employed an ingenious water system that allowed the city to thrive. Some have called it the Las Vegas of the ancient world. Let's watch a couple of short clips from a Nova documentary about Petra. And yes, this is where a scene from the third Indiana Jones movie was filmed. As you'll see from the video clip, which alas has a tendency to get yanked from YouTube, the entryway to the city is through a long, narrow canyon, almost a slot canyon. It's an amazing approach. I made it myself back in 2011, riding on a donkey. Put it on the list. While it was nicknamed the Treasury, this building was actually a mausoleum and perhaps also a temple. Note, too, that it's as much a sculpture as a building. This extraordinary monument was not built, but rather carved into the rock, like Mount Rushmore, although it's twice as large. Between the outer columns, we see two figures on horseback representing Castor and Pollux, the heavenly twins who guide souls of dead heroes to the Elysian fields. Within the porch, a room opens onto either side before the main entrance. The pediment is crowned with a disc between horns surrounded by ears of wheat, and these are all symbols of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of love and immortality, whom the Nabateans revered. The upper story is a broken pediment interrupted by a tholos. Isis, in her role as protector of the city, stands in the front bay of the tholos. Amazons bearing axes ornament the side bays of the tholos and the front and side bays of the broken pediments, while winged Nikes decorate the rear bays between the tholos and the pediments. In other words, the people of Petra, the Nabateans, borrowed from a lot of traditions. Note that eagles of Zeus crown the pediment, and the tholos finally is topped by a symbolic funerary urn. There's a mixture of Egyptian and Greek gods. The Nabateans were all about syncretism. So, what makes the style of the Petra treasury Hellenistic? Above all, it is eclectic. Again, that means it draws on traditions from different parts of the late Greek Empire. So on the bottom, we see what looks like a traditional Greek temple with Corinthian columns that are identified as a later work. Some of the columns are, however, engaged, and that reflects Etruscan and Roman temple design. The tholos was an architectural style popular in Alexandria, Egypt, one of the major power centers of the Hellenistic Empire. On the right, you see an artist's reconstruction of the long-since destroyed lighthouse at Alexandria, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Note that there's a tholos at the top. Here's another building that may be misnamed. Within the cella, or inner sanctuary room of the Great Temple, archaeologists have discovered a series of stone seats. This suggests the structure was used not only as a temple, but as an audience hall, at least for part of its history. The complex consists of a lower temenos, or holy area, accessed by a steep staircase, and an upper temenos that contains the temple proper. There's one more theory about this building, that it was the center of a vast system designed to channel water from nearby hills. Let's watch a short video clip that shows the Great Temple and describes its water channels. If we'd kept watching the video, you'd have seen this imaginative reconstruction of the temple complex and its water pools. Back to Rome. Now the maps begin to shrink. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, pulled the frontier back to the Euphrates. This latest phase of the Pax Romana lasted until Marcus Aurelius broke from the tradition of the adoptive emperors and named his son Commodus emperor. Commodus turned out to be a really lousy emperor, and the Pax Romana began to decay. In the half-century after 235 CE, there were 15 emperors, and most of them were generals who only ruled for a few years before they were killed or overthrown. Meanwhile, Rome's enemies were becoming more powerful. In the east, the Parthians had been replaced in 226 CE by the Sassanid Persians, who sought to restore the glory of the Persian Empire by pushing Rome out of the east. In the west, Germans raided deep into the empire, reaching the Mediterranean at several points. This portrait bust of one of the so-called soldier emperors, Trajan Decius, again signals a return to a veristic style. But even more, I think it captures the political turmoil and anxiety of the late Roman Empire. This was not an especially triumphant emperor. You saw an excellent Khan Academy video describing this work, I hope, so I'll just hit on a few points in review. First, the composition is chaotic. This work is not intended to capture an orderly procession or a victory march. The Romans are winning, and they're depicted as sterner, more determined, and more disciplined than their barbarian foes. But at this point in the history of the Roman Empire, the Romans can no longer count on always defeating the barbarians. Notice, too, how the figures float in space. The ground line has disappeared. This is a movement away from realism and naturalism. It's a mistake to assume that Roman sculptors had simply lost the skill for creating more realistic images. This was almost certainly a conscious rejection of the calm classicism of earlier Roman art. But it's also hard not to believe that it reflected a greater uncertainty and anxiety in the face of the empire's decline. Another sign of change is the symbol on the young commander's forehead. It seems to indicate that he had embraced one of the many Eastern mystery religions, the worship of Mithras. As Rome faced increasing dangers, both within and without, more Romans found the old gods inadequate for their spiritual needs. One of the new religions from the East was, of course, Christianity. And this brings us to the end of our Greece and Rome unit. We will return to late Empire Rome in Unit 6 when we take up the story of Christianity. But first, we are going to explore the art of three other great religious traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and